Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rebecca Smith-Aldridge, the Mid-Hudson Library System Executive Director, and we're pleased to have you here today for our Core Values and Ethics, which we're also calling Policies 101. I'm joined this morning by Casey Conlon, who you heard from earlier, who's on deck to both help with the workshop content today and also field any technical questions you might have. So I think it's really clear you can use the chat or questions box at any point. So today you are the first group to go through this webinar with us. Thanks to COVID, we've transitioned our entire trustee education series online, and this is a brand new webinar to, I think, speak to the new construct that we're all finding ourselves in. So instead of having a big, long 3-hour trustee essentials workshop, we've broken it up into a couple of different components. So the focus today on core values and ethics, our hope is to give you a real compass setting when you're doing your policy-making role on your board. So to help with that work, what we're going to be doing is sharing some basics as well as looking at some mini case studies. And Casey and I feel comfortable presenting this workshop today. I've spent about 20 years helping libraries with technical issues and legal issues and helping coach them through problems. And it's amazing how often it comes back to what policy you had in place to guide yourself through some of the issues that comes up when you have a public library in your community. Now, Casey's actually been a library director, so he's been on the front lines of a lot of what happens in libraries and has his own war stories from his own perspective. So I think between the two of us here, we've got a good background to help you with this issue today. And what we thought would be helpful is to really bring it back to the beginning and really start looking at the basics of why American public libraries are such a cornerstone of democracy. We are some of the most trusted institutions in our communities, most of which is really can be traced back to the Library Bill of Rights, the core values of librarianships, and the way trustees conduct themselves, the ethics of trustees that govern local libraries. And all of those things flow into policy making for a library. So we're going to touch on all of those things here this morning, and then cap off the morning with some mini case studies and give you a chance to think through some issues and kind of choose your own adventure of how you might deal with a situation that you might come across while you're on your library board. Now, before we get started, we wanted to offer you the print copy of the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, and thanks for your attendance here today. This is a publication that some people call the Trustee Bible. It's one of the only reference documents you have as a public library trustee. You can freely access it online, but if you'd like a print copy, you can email Joan K at jkkay@midhudson.org using this email workshop code TE92020, and we'll email that to you after the session today in case you'd like to get that free copy of the handbook sent over to your library for you to pick up. Now, in that handbook, you're going to see a whole chapter on policies, which I think is good because it's good to have that reference point for some of the stuff that we'll talk about here today. But when you check out that chapter in the handbook, you note that the authors talk about the need for an open mind and a thoughtful study of the issues involved, as well as a deep understanding of the library's mission and of the community it serves. And so that really brings to bear, I think, asking you to actively participate in policymaking. And you may find yourself on the policy committee of the library, but if not, you're certainly going to be in the general sessions when policies are recommended to the board. And it's really all board members' responsibilities to participate in this activity. Policies really shape the atmosphere you create in your library. It also provides critical legal protection, and it's every library trustee's responsibility to protect the reputation of the library and to keep it on the right side of the law. I think we can all agree that that's an important thing. And so policymaking might seem overwhelming, and our job today here is to make it less overwhelming, to increase your confidence when you're doing work in this area through your volunteer work at your library. We understand that most of you are not lawyers or CPAs, and you're just good people trying to do good work on behalf of your community, and we just want to give you a fighting chance to do that work in a way that protects your library and creates a quality library experience for the maximum number of people who come through the doors of the library. So let's jump right in and talk about the Library Bill of Rights. Now, you should have received a handout packet for the workshop yesterday. If you didn't receive that, I believe Casey's going to be able to share that in the chat box for you. But in your packet, you'll see page 1 of the handout packet is the actual Library Bill of Rights, which is an organization, it comes from an organization called the American Library Association, or ALA, which you might be familiar with. You might even be a member of it. Maybe you've joined the United for Libraries. section of the American Library Association. This is the premier library association literally in the world. So this is an organization that's been around for over 100 years. It's really the best and the brightest of the library community, helping to shape policies for libraries. But this is a document that's been in place for a very long time. The original origin of it was from 1939, and it has certainly, been updated or amended here and there, but the core aspects of it have not changed. The idea that public libraries should be open to all, that it shouldn't matter what your background is, how much schooling you've had, how much money you have in your pocket, or what ethnicity you are. You come right through those doors and the library staff and collections and programs are there for you to access. So the same idea applies to the materials being accessible, that all materials should be accessible to people who are interested in them. So if we think about the whole idea of kind of one of the tenets of American life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you can't do that when someone's prescribing your quest for knowledge. And libraries are really built on the premise that you should have a sense of self-determination when it comes to education for yourself, your children, and working with others to make your community a better place. And the library becomes a platform for that. So the idea of no barriers, that you have access to the resources, that you can request things and have them brought to your library if you don't have them locally, all of these things should be happening with this lens of regardless of origin, age, background, or views. And that's very controversial in the year 2020. Maybe less so a couple of years ago, but this time around, we're seeing more and more people who would like to prescribe to us what we see and hear and read, and have you look at it through their lens. And libraries are really there to encourage people to create their own worldview, to understand the world based on the knowledge contained in our books, in our programs, and the databases that we offer through fiction, through nonfiction, and really suit the need of the particular learner who walks through that door. So this tenet of open to all, when you're writing policy or thinking about it, you want to remove as many barriers to access as possible. And that's a tough thing for a lot of library people, particularly library staff people, who are often drawn to the profession because they like the rules. They like the rules of the Dewey Decimal System and resource sharing standards, and that there's very black and white boundaries that they operate within. And sometimes that gets in the way of common sense access to things. And so we really have to question sometimes why we do things the way we do. If you hear the phrase, well, we've always done it that way, that's a big red flag to turn around and say, well, let's look at that one a little closer, because times may have changed since the last time that rule was made. And we always want to bring it back to some of these core principles that we find in the Library Bill of Rights and the core values, which we're going to take a look at next. Now, also within the Library Bill of Rights, you're going to see language that's related to being nonpartisan. And this is often confused with being neutral. Libraries are definitely not neutral, but we should absolutely be nonpartisan. We don't want to see library collections or governance decisions being influenced by a political party or a particular point of view, whether it be religious or social. We want it to be, again, as open as possible so the maximum number of people see themselves reflected in the library that they're helping to invest in. So the nonpartisan issue, this can become tough. Sometimes you'll get complaints from patrons who think maybe your library staff has developed a collection that leans one way or another politically. That might be true. Maybe it's not, but that deserves someone looking into it to make sure they don't feel like they're not being represented in your library. Sometimes there's extreme cases where somebody might have kind of an outlier view or an extreme view that you're going to have to make a judgment call on of whether or not that actually reflects your community and who lives in your town. And sometimes those can be tough conversations for boards. And it's good to be thinking about this kind of stuff before these issues come up. And that's a lot of what policymaking is about, is thinking through some of the tough things that might happen or worst case scenarios and thinking through the right way to handle something both in a legal and ethical way. So one of those things that can come up is censorship. And we have an annual day and actually a whole week now devoted to this nationally, because people still challenge books in library collections, books you might really be surprised at what's getting challenged. And really the idea here is that we don't let any one person influence what's in our collections. We have collection development policies that are board approved, that set community standards for what will be in the collection. We hire library professionals who are trained in selection for our collections to build collections that meet the needs of our community. And if you have one or two people that are unhappy with something, it doesn't mean we don't listen to what they have to say, but we certainly want to take that very seriously and have a thoughtful consideration of the objections they may have to something in our collections. And there's a whole process that you can follow to help with that issue. We do ask that if you do have a challenge to materials at your libraries, that you report that to the American Library Association so they can track what types of materials are being challenged in library collections, so they can recognize patterns and trends that might be emerging, which definitely has served all libraries in our communities well, as we understand what other communities are dealing with. So don't hide that one under a basket there. Get that one out in the light of day. Don't be afraid to discuss those things out in open. I think it's important for those voices to be heard. And again, for Sunshine to really shine on these issues to make sure they're transparent and people understand why decisions are being made the way they are at your library. The Library Bill of Rights also talks about equitable access to gathering spaces. And again, it goes back to kind of an American value that we have the right to gather and to think together and to talk to one another. And library spaces are considered public forums where people of different viewpoints can come together and learn from each other. So your meeting room policies are very critical. If you're a library lucky enough to have a meeting room, you'll need to have a policy that's related to that meeting space that makes it clear who uses that space, under what conditions, and what challenges there may be if someone would like to hold the type of event at your library that's really not okay in a public space. So there's a lot of literature on this particular issue of meeting spaces in libraries. It's actually been a number of huge court cases in America related to this, both from people trying to say someone shouldn't be allowed to use the library's meeting space to groups that have been denied use of the library's meeting space by the library itself. So a very key thing to understand about library meeting spaces is that if you offer them for use for the public, meaning not just for library programs run by your staff, if you let community groups come in or a book group not sponsored by the library to use the library's meeting space, once you make that decision, the meeting space really is open to all. You can't decide that you don't want to have the Presbyterians come in, but the Catholics can come in. You can't say the Republicans can come in, but the Democrats can't come in. So you can't judge the content that the group would like to talk about, but you certainly could limit the type of meeting that someone would like to have. You can certainly say no religious services or no political rallies, but you couldn't say no to a meeting of the minds, basically, of people who want to get together and talk about a common issue. So you can see pretty quickly how that could become controversial in the day we live in today. So making sure your meeting policy is up to date and fair to everyone in the community is very important. The other thing we'll talk about a little later is making sure you have grievance procedures in your policies in case someone feels your policy is treating them unfairly. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later when we talk about policy basics. The next thing we wanted to chat with you about is the core values of librarianship, because we find these also guide why we do what we do in libraries. And some of you may be familiar with this book or have heard me talk about it in other workshops, but it's something that just rings so true with so many of the things that we deal with in libraries, from policy making to marketing decisions to programs we choose to do. This is a book by Simon Sinek called Start With Why. He calls this the golden circle, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But the whole premise of his book was really from a marketing strategy as a business consultant who really has taken a hard look at some of the biggest corporations in our country to say, how come that corporation is succeeding while this one over here is not? And he noticed a pattern in their marketing messaging that corporations that were more, or businesses that were more successful, their marketing messages had a pattern in which they talk about why they do what they do before they tell you what they do. And his famous example is Apple computers. And many of us have iPhones or iPads or Mac devotees. And he talks about how this company, when they came onto the market in the 1980s, they really talked about why they were creating the computers they did the way they did. Unlike other businesses who were talking about the technical specifications of their computers, about how much memory it had, how fast the drives were, how crystal clear the monitors were. But this company, Apple, was talking about human-centered design that was aesthetically beautiful and fun to interact with. And that quickly appealed to people who were not techies and really exploded the mass market appeal of this product before people ever learned what the technical specifications were of those particular computers. Now, you might feel I've gone quite a far afield here talking about this issue, but I think you can see how it might translate to libraries as well. We do a lot of very important work for our communities, and we spend a lot of time, our staff do, on websites, social media posts, newsletters that tell you all the things you can access, all the books you can get, all the programs you can come to. But we often forget to tell the story of why we do those things. And policies are very much centered in why we do things. If we think about the important work that we do and why we do it, that should be reflected in our policies. How we do it should also be reflected in those policies. And that's what we want to talk to you about in terms of the core values of librarianship. You have a whole list in your packet of all the core values, but Casey and I are doing something a little different today, and we've reorganized them using the structure of why, how, and what. Why do we do what we do? And we think there's two really clear reasons on that core values list of why we do what we do. We think sustainability is an incredibly important part of the work that libraries do, that we are contributing to the thriving life in our communities. We are creating a balance in communities that make sure that our services are socially equitable, economically feasible, and environmentally sound. If we think about how we build communities for the future, it really does take everyone participating in our communities to be informed, to understand how other people's lives may not be like theirs. It means they may need to be heard in different ways. But the whole goal here is to create balance in our lives so that we have healthy places to raise our children and to learn and to live out our lives. And to do that, you need balance in a community. You need to make sure that all people are heard, that there's a diversity of opinion that's been considered when making decisions that impact everybody in a community, that we have a healthy natural world in which to live, to actually have clean air, which is a big deal in our world this week, given the wildfires out in California and that smoke making its way over to us, and economically feasible, that we're creating affordable places to live and places where people of all income brackets are finding value in the place that they live. And libraries greatly contribute to all three aspects of this. So this idea of creating balance and thinking about sustainability in the programs we produce. Are we providing access to materials that enhance people's lives in these areas? Are we providing programs that help to educate people in new ways, to add value to their lives, to connect people with their neighbors and strengthen the social fabric of our communities? These are all things that libraries contribute to if we're deliberate about it. I think libraries that are kind of scattered and doing programs all over the place and don't really have a vision for why they're doing what they're doing find they're not quite as successful as those libraries who have a clear vision, a clear plan of service, and goals and objectives that all push their activities towards that vision they have for the future. So at Mid-Hudson, we think a lot about sustainability and resilience and how libraries contribute to community resilience. So we hope that's also at the center of your thinking. We can only imagine why you chose to volunteer your time at your local public library. You had a lot of different choices of where you could volunteer your time, but you picked the library. And I bet to some degree, your personal why is tied to this idea of helping to create a stronger community through the services that your library provides. Now, the second idea we have here of why we do what we do in libraries is related to a core American element, which is democracy. And Casey's going to walk us through this one.
So the democracy one is amazing. When you read the democracy core value in the American Library Association's core values, it says that a democracy presupposes an informed citizenry. And that sounds very high and lofty, and I think that's because it is. And so that means that the democracy, the way we're trying to run things in this country and have people have a voice in the things that happen, in our legislation and, in our towns and in our nation, we need people to know what's going on. And so the library plays that role. We help people learn about whatever they want to learn about. And in the case of our democracy, people need to know about their elected representatives. And so they can come to the library and they can research through newspapers and magazines that we have both online and in print, and books and written by experts, and as well as the experts who can help you find these different resources, as well as just a plain old basic access to the internet in case people are not able to have that. As we've seen, there's a big digital divide. A lot of people don't have the internet at home. A lot of us are joining us today probably from our houses, and it's easy enough for us to have access to the internet. But if you don't and you still want to know what's going on in your community, you can go to your library and you can actually do that. So again, the idea that you can find out and you can be informed and you can help move the decisions that are made at the national level for who runs our entire country, who's running things at our state level, and even what's happening in the local government. We see libraries doing this, again, through providing information. And we also see many libraries who are actively encouraging people to register to vote, to be part of the democracy, and to participate in shaping our country and how things move forward. So I really love that, informed citizenry, that we presuppose that informed citizenry and that the libraries are a bulwark against that level of ignorance that might happen if there were nothing in the community to help people find the information they need to make informed decisions.
Throughout history, we found that communities that are more civically engaged have a healthier quality of life, and there's tons of research out there that point to this. And so we have to think of community well-being as part of the calling of library service. So on that list of core values, you see a number of things that I think inform how we carry out the work of our libraries, and social responsibility is a key element of that, that we all take responsibility for living in a just world that is environmentally sound, economically feasible, and respects the diversity of our communities. And that social responsibility element is something that we see so beautifully carried out in the Hudson Valley of New York. There's just example after example that, we've always been a very generous region, I think, but especially in the time of COVID, we've seen more and more people rise to the occasion to help with food security and insecurity issues, or the digital divide issues that Casey has spoken about. And really at the absolute end of the day, when we all think about why we're here and what we're doing, it really comes down to helping each other, whether that be your own family or your community members and your neighbors. But that idea of social responsibility is really a core value of librarianship, because of just that idea that none of us walks this world alone. And if we can learn from each other and learn from history, that might mean by working together, we can all find a brighter future for ourselves.
So as libraries, we provide, or we seek to provide at least, free and equitable access to the information and resources that we, keep in our buildings or have in our buildings in terms of programs, or that we provide through different websites and different third-party vendors like ebooks and databases. So the important part of that is recognizing the economic barriers to accessing information, and that the library helps people get over those barriers. So if you're ever thinking about charging a fee for somebody to use something from the library, you don't want to do that, because we seek through our core values to actually overcome economic barriers. Most people, or not most people, but there are many things out there that people could buy access to, but the library is here to provide you access, whether you have the funding to actually pay for that or not. The other thing that we're doing with access is we're making sure that the library and the collection and the resources are accessible to everybody in the community, and that means everybody. And so we talked about that earlier and how that's a little controversial now, but that regardless of your gender or your race or your economic position, that you can come into the library and access the resources. Some of these things hit a little bit closer to home when we think about the sprawl of our area and how rural some of our communities are. Are people getting the same level of access if they don't have access to a car? Is there public transportation that can bring people to the library to access the physical materials in the library and the programs? A lot of times we find, this is not necessarily the case. And so, if we're really going to truly bring that equitable access to our resources in our libraries, how can we go to the people out in our community?
So once they have access to information and the say databases, books on our shelves, all of the resources that we offer for information transfer and knowledge transfer to our community, a core value is confidentiality and privacy while they're accessing information in our libraries. Now, New York is actually unique in that there's a state law that protects library patron confidentiality. So this is not just a professional value, it's actually New York state law that people have the right to come in and seek information without the government looking over their shoulder, without their neighbor looking over their shoulder, and really making sure the staff are trusted individuals who will not talk about what the patron has decided to spend their time looking at, whether it be a work of fiction that's maybe a little racy, or maybe a very sensitive issue related to a personal issue they're having at home. So when we think about confidentiality and privacy, this is not just something that would be nice or we hold to a high ideal. You are actually required by law to protect patron privacy at your library. And this is something that at the first blush seems pretty simple and straightforward, but there's certainly some complications that can come into play at your library. And we're going to talk about some of those specifics when we take a look at the list of policies that your library should have. But the full idea here is that you can't fully engage in information seeking behavior if you're worried about being judged for what you're seeking to learn more about. Are there unhealthy permutations of that? Absolutely. And there are certainly challenging situations that libraries have found themselves in. But for the most part, the idea of privacy, I think, allows a wide world to be open to people to explore things and learn and figure out their own issues with a level of comfort that it's going to take for them to truly feel that they've been able to be trusted in that library space. So that's a very important thing for library staff to be trained on, not just left to chance. That ties into the idea of intellectual freedom, that if you have the freedom to pursue ideas and think through things, that's how some of the most amazing advancements in science and policy have happened in our world. When people have learned from the people who come before them and are able to think and iterate on that work that's also happened, that idea to explore new ideas and develop perhaps solutions that we need in the future that otherwise wouldn't have been produced. So that is definitely a high ideal we have with intellectual freedom, to read what you want to read, to learn from the past, to think through how that's going to apply to your own life or the wider world's future. That's, again, a critical component to the sustainability and democracy that we're seeking in our world today.
The diversity core value recognizes that our nation, one of the great things about our nation, and one of the things that makes our nation great, America, is the diversity of our country and our communities. And so the library should seek to recognize that diversity and to bring in the entire spectrum of creators of different works, whether it's the fiction or nonfiction, to bring that diverse spectrum again of voices so that we have a better perspective and so that we can build a better community and provide our communities with the kind of information that we need. The other thing that we want to think about when we think about diversity is creating spaces and services and policies that are reflective of the community that we serve. So when somebody comes into the library, are they going to see somebody who looks like them? Are they going to feel welcome by the policies that you have in the library? And above that, do you have people on the board or other governing bodies that are making decisions and setting policies that are going to be in line with all the folks in your community that you represent?
How we carry out our work definitely comes into service industry in some ways. We talk about this in customer service work we do with our library staff and our member libraries. The service that we provide and the professionalism with which we provide that service is part of why libraries are so well thought of in our region. When we think about how libraries are rated by their patrons when you do satisfaction surveys, they are usually commenting on the level of service they receive from your library staff. So again, building in policy that's related to this, whether it be a customer service policy, training for staff should be part of your policy to make sure your staff are supported well so they can provide quality service with professionalism. We are an area that is not rich with well-funded libraries that have dozens of professionally paid staff that have master's degrees in library science. We have many people who are just lay people who believe in the educational value of libraries and have found their way to working in libraries, but they might not have the background you get if you go to library school. So that investment level in your personnel policies related to your staff are really critical to the core values of making a quality library come to be. Because at the end of the day, that idea of the public good needs to be served through our public libraries. Now, when you read the specifics of the core values of librarianship in the handout in your packet, you'll notice the public good item is related to resisting the privatization of library services in our community. And that's driven by a couple of things that have happened in the past 25 years in other parts of the country, not something we've seen here, which are attempts to privatize library services. But the reason the National Association has resisted that is the concern that these core values will not be considered if we commodify library services and make it a business that really relies on the bottom line. They will be compromising some of these core values that really contribute to the, I think, the health and wellness of our communities and the way libraries are currently designed. So again, something we haven't seen in this region, but I think we wanted to explain why that is on the list from our national association. Now, the last thing we have in the ring of the golden circle there is what we do, and Casey's going to talk about this for us.
So this is the part that we all love to jump to. What am I going to do? I want to do something. Give me something. Let me do something. This is where the rubber meets the road, but it's really important that you remember all the scaffolding that the things that you do are built on. And so we all know this is the surface. This is what people see from the outside. They might not know that it's all built on diversity and some of the other core values we talked about before. But this is why that stuff is why this stuff works. So the education and lifelong learning, we've already got that, right? We have books that people can come in and get. We have ebooks, we have databases, we have articles. People can pursue their passions and people can learn new things and make their lives better for free by coming into the library, talking to the people that we have in the library, talking to the experts and finding information, accessing whatever they need to. Over 3 million items at this point in the catalog. And that was actually last year before a lot of libraries stepped up a lot of the online and on-demand services that you could get, including documentaries and movies and audiobooks and books. So there's probably 4 or 5 million different titles, different items that you could get from your local library. And we have one of these libraries in nearly every community in the Hudson Valley. We have 70 library buildings in the Hudson Valley. So all those places are dedicated to helping whoever comes in the door to pursue things that they're really interested in. A lot of times we'll do it with materials, with things that you can read or listen to. But we also have programs, and through those programs you can come in and you can meet your neighbors, and you can meet other people, and you can meet experts who right there, right in front of you, can tell you about things that you're interested in learning about. So this is a really important thing, and there's so many of our people in our communities who take advantage of this. The other thing that we the other thing that we do too is, if you have ever been to a story time, if you ever think about story time, you might think that it is actually for people to hang out a little bit and maybe catch up on Instagram or some magazines while their kids get read to by a children's librarian or a children's programmer. But at those educational story times, we're actually teaching children, yes, to love learning and to love phonics, and we're teaching them phonetic skills, but we're also teaching parents about their role, parents or whoever's a caregiver for a child, teaching those folks about their role as an educator in their child's life and teaching them skills and exercises that they can practice with their children to get them ready for kindergarten when they ultimately go there, and to help them build their language skills and their, again, love of learning and love of literacy. So the other element that we do for our community when we're actually doing things is preservation. And so preservation in this context means actually providing people with information when they need it in a format that they can actually use. So when we're thinking about all those other values back there, accessibility, and putting that together with this, do you have things for people who, in a way that they can use them? So do you have Spanish language materials for somebody who needs to read the materials in the language that they actually speak? Do you have large type materials? Do you have the handouts for the library, whether it's your newsletter? Is that available in large type for folks to be able to look at if they have vision issues, if there are people with vision issues? So the other thing that you're doing too is, a lot of us have local history collections. And so we're actually preserving the stories and the things that make our town the place where we live, our town or our community. So keeping in mind that we want to preserve those things in a physical sense so that they're not too hot or too cold or whatever can make a book or a physical item actually wear out, but also making sure that if we have things and we've made them electronically available, making sure that they're widely available and making sure that as many people as possible can access these things, and that we're migrating them to the most up-to-date platform so that they're not lost in translation or some kind of shuffle, so that they're not on a, let's say, 3.5-inch floppy disk. We want to make sure that we have up-to-date files, and we want to make sure that we're sharing this as broadly as possible. The Hudson River Valley Heritage is a really good example of that. If you go on there, you can read all about and you can see lots of items that tell the story of the places that we live.
Thank you, Casey. I was thinking this might be a good spot for us to pause to see if any questions have come in so far that we might want to address now.
Yeah, so we had a question from somebody who said, in regards to patron privacy, what is the extent of liability? And should this be discussed with employees at their first hiring?
So taking that first question first, I'm sorry, the second question first of discussing with the staff during their orientation, absolutely. It is an area of not only legality, but library policy that will come into play right at the front desk of the library. So even library clerks and volunteers who may work at your library need to be aware of this tenet that is actually a law, not just a high ideal. So I think in terms of the legal liability, it is pretty significant. You'll find even if a law enforcement officer, say a state trooper, walked in the library and asked to see something related to libraries' patrons' borrowing habits, the staff is not allowed to turn that over without legal documentation presented by the state trooper, by a court order or a subpoena. So if we think about the fact that if a court case had advanced and it was found that the library betrayed that aspect of the patron's trust in the organization, you could be pulled into a civil lawsuit, which we have seen happen. So I think it's not only the legal ramifications of breaking the law and not respecting patron privacy, there's also the reputational damage that gets done. If people start to think that if you go to the library, that the staff is tattling about what you borrow or what you're looking at, that becomes a barrier to access. So people no longer feel it's a safe place to come and do an internet search on a health issue they may be having, or a sensitive family issue related to struggles they might be having with their child or their spouse. So the damage, I think, is both litigious in that you could be sued over it, but also I think the reputational damage that then translates into that barrier to access is also very damaging to the library overall.
Okay. That was all the questions that I see so far. We just had the one question, but I want to encourage anybody who has any questions to pop them in the question box or to put them in the chat box. I'll be watching both of those.
Cool. So that question really helps us segue to this next part here, which is the whole idea that your role at the library, you're called a trustee, which has that word trust embedded in it, that you're being trusted with the assets of the community, whether that be the public dollars that are invested in the library facility that's been entrusted to your care, the library staff who you are entrusted with paying a living wage and treating humanely and making sure that all the laws that influence personnel issues are being followed. You are being trusted with this work. And that's a big responsibility. And so I think one of the ways that library trustees have been successful in their tenures of retaining that trust and retaining the good reputation of the library while they serve on the board often boils down to trustee ethics, the ethics you have while you do the work of governing the library. You're part of a team. And I think when you have a team, it's really important to have rules of how your team will work together. And the trustee ethics statement from the United for Libraries, which is a division of the American Library Association, is a great spot to take a look at. And a lot of libraries in our region have adopted this ethics statement, which you find in your packet on page 9. They've actually adopted this statement as part of their policy manual. So right up front, it guides how trustees and boards will behave while working together. And you can see at the second page of that document on page 10, there's actually a signature line so that during a trustee's orientation to their work on the board, they're introduced to basically these guiding principles of how we do work here at this library when you serve on our board. And it's I think a leg up basically to create the culture that makes for a very effective board who can hold their head high and do good work on behalf of the community. And if you've got someone who might be an outlier or a rogue member of the board, it gives you a methodology to help bring them into the fold or help them see maybe this isn't the place for them when it comes to where they're going to do their community service in their community. So taking a look at that document, I hope you've all got it in front of you. There are, I think, important behavioral things that many of us would think, well, of course I would respect the opinions of my colleagues and not be critical or disrespectful. But you may have someone who comes on your board who's never served on a board before, who maybe their working life didn't have them working on a team. Maybe they had very independent work and they're not used to that level of group dynamics, and this might be a new experience for them. And it right away sets that expectation of behavior. You might think the second one is silly, that you will comply with all the laws, rules, and regulations. Well, of course we would. But then you've got issues of how aware are all of your trustees of all of the laws, rules, and regulations. So it just heightens the awareness that perhaps we should ask the question, is there a law or regulation that ties to the issue that we're debating at the board that we should be aware of during those conversations. So fulfilling the responsibilities, not being swayed by partisan interests, public pressure, or fear of criticism. And most library issues aren't that dire or serious or dramatic, but every once in a while you touch on an issue that can get dramatic, where you can have an outside player come in and try to influence the outcome that maybe isn't in the best interest of the community at large. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about library boards in our region is how they're very good at putting the community at the center of their decision making and not themselves or their personal interests or their allyship perhaps in the community with another organization. One of the I think the things we cover in Trustee Essentials that stands out is that statement that was put out by the New York State Board of Regents that talks about that duty of care, the duty of loyalty, and the duty of obedience to the organization, that we're there to do the work of the library on behalf of our neighbors. And so that ethical standpoint that we start off on the right foot, putting the community at the center of the decisions that we make, not an individual board member or the director or a library staff person that's unhappy. We always have to reset that frame so the community is at the center of those conversations that we have. You can see items here that you will not engage in discrimination, that you have to distinguish clearly in your actions and statements between your personal philosophies and those of the library, which we just touched on. And really, I think honoring consensus, that if you've got a great board president who helps everyone be heard on a topic, and we all understand where we're coming from before we take a vote, once the results of that vote take place, the board should be comfortable moving forward with the majority's decision. And that can be hard sometimes when you have controversial issues. But if we understand that rule going in, it becomes less of a zero-sum game where someone feels like if they don't get their way, it's the wrong decision. It's hard to operate that way when you've got a board of 11 people who all think their opinion is the one that needs to be heightened to the point of decision, the right decision. That's not going to go well for anybody involved. This one touches on confidentiality, which we've already talked about. Avoid interests in which personal interests might be served or financial benefits might be gained as a result of your position. This can come out unintentionally sometimes. You might be part of a business or have a family member that's part of a business that also wants to do business with the library. You'd have to be sure to recuse yourself from any vote that would have a financial windfall for you or your family. If you find that happening over and over again, it might be time to resign from the board. Like if you have a family member who works for the library, it's the very reason that people who work for the library don't also serve on the board. Let's see, we've also got disqualifying yourself whenever that appearance of the conflict of interest exists, which we just touched on. So that could be if you own a company that might benefit from the library. Again, a staff person who is related to you, there might be conversations you need to recuse yourself from a conversation related to that in case it gets emotional for you. You want to make sure it's not about you or that staff person, but the right thing to do for the organization. So I think you get the sense of where the ethics statement is going here. So if your board doesn't have an ethics statement, I'd encourage you to have one. Sometimes it takes the form of a policy. There's also a sample ethics policy available from United for Libraries. But if you don't have this at your library as a new board member, you might bring this to the table or suggest to your board president that it be considered. It's way easier to adopt something like this when things are going well than it is if you have a problem on the board or one of the trustees is not following something ethically or behaving in an ethical manner. When you try to superimpose this at that point in the conversation, it's far less effective. So adopting it early when things are going well, I think is a very good practice for boards. So jumping into policymaking here, we've given you, I think, kind of the landscape of the platform from which you stand on when you are making policies for the library. And as new trustees, you've likely inherited a number of policies that were already created by previous board members. So the important thing to understand about policies is that they have to be written down and board approved. And you might think this sounds silly that we put this on the slide here today, but it can't be enforced, and it's not a legal document unless it is written and board approved, and you can point to the minutes of an open meeting in which it was discussed and voted on by the library board. So at the bottom of each policy, it's important to actually notate when it was considered and passed by the board with the date and the last day it was reviewed. And you're going to see Casey's going to talk about in a minute about why that's so important. We definitely have libraries where when they have a problem and they give us a call and they ask us, what do we do? We say, okay, what does your policy say? Well, we've always done X, Y, and Z. Well, that's nice, but what did your policy say? What did the board approve for you to do in this situation? Oh, well, we never voted on it. It's just the way we do things. Well, that's hearsay, right? So we need things, again, written down, board approved, demonstrated in the minutes that it was a legal decision made by the board. The way I think about library policies is that they're the micro laws of the library. So you've got laws that are passed by elected officials, say at the state or federal level. Obviously, we have to follow those laws or require to. Then you've got regulation that comes from perhaps the Office of the State Comptroller or the Education Commissioner, which libraries are required to follow. Then you've got the micro laws of the library. There's those places in between that need guidance in which the library board steps in to make policy to guide the library's approach on issues that are not clarified perhaps by law or by regulation. So they technically are laws of the library that you pass. So the library board itself is a collective. You can only make decisions when you are together at an open meeting and you again all agree on that document and approve it with a majority vote, hopefully a unanimous vote that everyone's had a chance to understand the issue and move that forward. So as you are faced with voting on something, or maybe you're on the policy committee and helping to the director write something or respond to something the director has written, there are those how statements again, those guiding principles. You know, when you look at a policy that might be related to library cards, you know, really thinking through, are we giving the maximum people access to what they need through our library? Testing for confidentiality, testing for intellectual freedom, thinking about social responsibility. Are we doing our best by the people who actually live in this community? Maybe not just the patrons who currently walk through your door, but everyone who lives in your community who has the right to be served by your library. So you can see how these how statements that we identified on that core values list can come into play while you're considering one policy or another, whether it be a public-facing policy that deals with the library's collection or meeting space or bulletin board, or a personnel policy that helps to shape how your staff are treated while serving the public on your behalf at the library. Now, way back when we started the workshop, I mentioned grievance procedures. And so many of your policies, as you have heard, as we've talked about this morning, they might have a controversial aspect to them or just something one patron just plain doesn't like. They may have been reprimanded or asked to leave the library for behavior that was unbecoming, and they may feel they were treated unfairly. They should have recourse to come back and be reconsidered. If they don't like what the director has said, they should have recourse to approach the board about that. But you don't want to have it kind of the Wild West. There should be a procedure in place where perhaps they fill out a form to explain the situation for consideration or reconsideration. We want it to be a civil process, not something that puts the director in an awkward position, because really your policies are what guides your director's management decisions, and you should be backing them up. If they carried out the policy that you approved, you should back them up when they carry it out. That doesn't mean there aren't strange situations that arise that might, you know, cause a reconsideration of a policy. And sometimes a patron works with the director on coming up with a different way to manage a policy. That's not unheard of. But it also can't become the tail wagging the dog. If the policy is in place for a good reason that benefits the majority of people in the community, you don't want to write policies that are really for one specific situation or one individual. That's when we've seen other court cases come out against libraries. There's a famous case from New Jersey called the Kramer case, in which a library wrote a policy very specifically to address the behavior of a patron who was coming into the library, who was quite odorous, shall we say, very smelly, and brought in a lot of bags with them that had pests. I think it was fleas were jumping off of the bag, and the person definitely had a mental illness and was behaving strangely with the staff. They were following the staff members around, walking very closely behind them and making the staff very uncomfortable. And so they wrote a policy that said, if you smell weird, bring a lot of baggage into the library and follow the staff around, you're not allowed to come in the library anymore. And that patron sued the library and won because the policy had been written specifically to ban that individual individual from the library, rather than describing a broader base of behaviors that are unacceptable in the public space. So that grievance procedure can be a legal protection. So it provides a second step in a policy, that maybe you wrote a policy, you did it with good intent, it gets out into the real world and gets tested, and it works or it doesn't work sometimes. And if it doesn't work, having that grievance procedure provides a pressure valve for someone to come in and challenge it and give you a graceful way to address the issue, to either double down on it because it truly is the right thing, or to acknowledge that, yeah, we should probably think a little differently about that one now that it's been tested. So it gives that kind of buffer between the black and white issue of it going south and someone suing you. It provides a reasonable way for a patron or a staff person to pursue redress on the issue. Casey, can you talk a little bit about the review thing? Because this is something that's always been best practice, but now is going to be required by the state.
Yes. So if the webinars so far weren't enough motivation to review your policies, if it's been a while and you don't really want to dust them off and take a look at them, it is now required that every 5 years you review your policies that you have written out and approved. You may have to review them more frequently as required by law. So the idea here, I think, is that your policies don't fall too out of date and that you're actually aware of what's there in the policies and what you're actually asking people to do, and checking to make sure that, you know, all the things that we've talked about previously, the policies fit into those things, and all the core values that we've talked about are applicable, and all the laws that may have come out in the last 5 years are not in violation. Your policies are not in violation of those laws. So we're going to review all of the minimum standards that are being updated, and some of the old ones too, in case you want a little refresher on what's in those minimum standards on September 22nd. You all are welcome to come to that webinar. That'll be at 5:30 p.m. that day.
Great, thanks, Casey. One of the things that we find that trustees and staff sometimes struggle over is the difference between policy and procedure. So as trustees, you're the governing board of the library. You are making governance decisions through policy. And you can tell the difference sometimes when you start getting into the how the policy will be carried out, when you get into the procedural issues of kind of the micro decision making related to the policy. That is much better left to the staff to figure out. So policy, the level at which you are focused on, it has widespread application on a topic. It's something that, you know, that 5-year window should be good enough. You don't have to touch it every year, hopefully. I can't think of really any example of a policy that you have to touch every year. It's talking in broad terms about the topic, and it's really focused on the why we need to have a decision in this area by the board that's consistently applied, or the what is the issue that needs attention by the board. The procedural aspect of things is, you know, taking the library card policy that the board approved, which says any resident of the town is eligible for a library card, and then the procedure written by the staff might tie into the mechanics of how a card is issued in the Sierra system. That, okay, we're going to need proof of ID and validation of your address and those types of decisions. That's at the staff level, figuring that out with the technology that intersects with the policy. And those things can change, right? You can change as best practice evolves, as system standards change through the Directors Association of the Mid-Hudson Library System. It's very detail oriented, and that's really not the board's responsibility. That's exactly why you have professional staff to work through the kind of the very fine tuning of how we actually carry this out. So good, you want to make sure you spend your time wisely on the board. You definitely want to spend your time on the things that matter most and need your attention from the role point and the perspective that you bring to the table. And then respecting that expertise at the staff level to figure out the kind of ins and outs of how we actually carry it out. Sometimes they might bring something back to you and ask for opinion. Does this seem fair? Or do you think this will go over well with the public? And that's certainly fine. But I think you really want to leave that kind of stuff to the staff. It's not necessarily your area of expertise, and your area of expertise is greatly needed at the governance level of policymaking. So in your packet, you've got the last 2 pages are the recommended policies checklist, which probably looks familiar if you came to our Trustee Essentials workshop. It's the same list that we've used in the past, although, you know, what's interesting was some questions we got at the last Trustee Essentials workshop and something that just happened very recently in New York State law. This list just got added to, so the one on your screen doesn't match the one in the packet already, but that's a good lesson to learn when it comes to policies, because laws change, whether or not you're paying attention or or not. And Mid-Hudson, we do our best to keep our eye on that and let your directors know when things change, but we certainly can't promise that we're going to catch everything. So that's also part of your director's job, is to be scanning and listening and watching the news to see when laws change or personnel issues arise that might need a new policy related to them. Now, on this recommended policies checklist, it might look like a long list to you, but I'll say that most of your libraries already have many of these things in place, so you may be only coming into contact with them when it's time to review them. But there's a few policies that are on here that intersect with law that I wanted to point out to you. And the very first one we've already touched on, which is in the what we call external list. So you can see on that first page that it's broken into external policies and internal policies. External policies are classified as those that have contact with the public, so outwardly facing. So, patron interaction with your staff, with your collection, with your facility, with your technology. These are all policies that help guide that and help your staff consistently respond to issues that may arise with a patron. Your staff are doing their best. They have a lot of responsibilities. When issues crop up, the more they've already been thought through and are guided by policy that have been backed up by training of your staff, the more consistently your staff knows what to do in those situations. The tough thing for library staff is when there's not any guidance or they haven't been trained and they're confronted with a tough issue. They do their best in that moment, but you are putting a lot of pressure on them to make the right call. You're asking someone who might be part-time on the front lines to make decisions that may have legal implications, might have reputational implications, and you're leaving an awful lot to chance if there hasn't been policy making and training that's been done to help support that staff person make good choices in the moment on behalf of your institution. So believe it or not, staff like policies. They like when there are clear answers for things. So the more of these policies that are in place, the better off you are from a legal standpoint to protect the organization. But also I think it takes a ton of pressure off your staff because these tough things have been thought through. They know what to do. They know when to, kick something up the chain to the director. So policies really, I think, play a big part in the day-to-day of your library operations, more than you might realize. So in that external list, there are some that are kind of left up to the library board and director of the type of atmosphere you're trying to create, like customer service. But as we've discussed, patron confidentiality, that's not optional. That's overseen by law. Your lending rules, these are things that you define, but of course they intersect with some system level lending rules that the Directors Association agrees upon. So you need your director's technical expertise to help with those. Under collection, I wanted to point out collection development. That's a very library ease, kind of like library speak term, but this is how the board defines what areas of the collection will be developed for your community. So are you a popular reading library? Are you a research library? Do you specialize in local history? Is it a combination of those three things that need to be balanced so your director knows where to do purchasing and development in? This is setting the tone for the type of collection that you will have. And a very important component of that is having a statement about weeding the collection, which is another library specific term. Most of us are familiar with weeding, like I had to weed my walk last weekend because the weeds were growing up. But this is kind of the same idea where you've got books in the collection or items in the collection that are outdated. Maybe they are ragged and smelly because so many people have loved them and borrowed them so often that need to come out of the collection. Either because there's misinformation, out of date information, it's in such poor quality that it's embarrassing to hand it over to somebody and needs to be replaced. Books have a very emotional tie to people. You yourself may feel very emotional about books. Maybe you don't like to throw out books. Maybe it's very hard for you to part with books and donate them someplace. I know it is in my house. But in a public library, it's very critical that we have quality collections with up-to-date information that are sanitary and that are attractive to people to borrow. So they'll actually take them out and read them and learn from them. So having a statement about weeding is really critical. So your library staff has the license to weed the collection, and that if you had a patron freak out because they saw a bunch of books piled up for discard or donated someplace else, that they don't freak out, because this is really a normal library science activity. And so we need to make sure the library staff has the backing to do what needs to get done. Censorship we touched on earlier in our talk this morning. In public space section here, there's a number of really critical things, as you can imagine. I just want to start with that first one on the list, accessibility or ADA statement. And I'm sorry, there's an acronym there without an explanation. But ADA is the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires that public spaces be accessible to people of all physical abilities. So if you find that your library facility is not fully accessible to someone with a disability, whether they're in a wheelchair or using a walker or a cane, that's something that really has to be thought through legally by the library, because you definitely can be sued for not providing access to all in the community. If your library isn't currently fully accessible, you need to have this statement, which explains how you will provide an equitable level of service to someone who maybe can't physically access your building or a part of your building. Some of our libraries are in older historic buildings that have different levels and there was no way to get an elevator in there, but perhaps you can get the same level of service by putting a policy in place that would say, if you can't get to this area of our facility, let us know. We'll have a staff person work with you, or we have an arrangement with a library down the road who has a similar service that you can get to. You just have to acknowledge that barrier to access and have thought through the solutions for it. So the onus is not on the patron to fight for that right. That should be something that's already been thought through. Exhibiting and posting sounds very simple, but your library bulletin board, who's allowed to put things up, who's allowed to put things down. We have a lot of very funny and some very scary stories about what the public has put up on library bulletin boards and public uproar when staff have taken things down. So very good thing to have in place ahead of time to give your director the right to take down anything that was not a library posting. Your incident report form is an important legal and liability issue. If there's an incident with someone slipping and falling at the library, someone slips on the sidewalk in front of the library, someone falls down in the library, these are all things we immediately want to capture the particulars of that situation. So the staff should be trained in doing incident report forms so they know what to do in case the library gets sued later on. Having that documentation of the eyewitness account will be very important. It's also very important if you've got an issue with a patron who might be exhibiting problematic behavior, either harassing staff or other patrons, or causing problems in the library on a regular basis. Having those incident report forms lined up can really help when you have to call the police and they need to see that pattern of behavior that you've been dealing with. The patron code of behavior is incredibly important. We mentioned earlier that the library is a limited public forum, which means anyone can walk through your door, right? Wasn't that wonderful when we started with the whole open to all thing? But then the reality of being a public building sets in when you realize that, yep, anyone can walk through our door, which creates a multitude of different behaviors that your staff may observe and experience. So while anyone can walk through your door, it doesn't mean they can behave any way they choose to. You want to have a patron code of conduct that allows for the staff to deal with someone who is disruptive in the environment, that is ruining the experience for other people in that space, because we want it to be as open and accessible to as many people as possible. And if people feel intimidated by someone's behavior, are being harassed while they're using the library, if your staff are being harassed while this person is in the library, there needs to be recourse to deal with that behavior. Almost like progressive discipline, where they get warned, they might get suspended and possibly banned from using the library. That's not unheard of in some public libraries. The technology area, I think libraries have gotten very, very good at. In the 1990s, this was a hot topic, but not so much anymore. Libraries have pretty much mastered what those policies need to look like. But that takes us to the second part of this, which is the internal policies on the list. This is kind of like the backstage operations of the library, the things that kind of make it all work, right? Your board, your administration policies, financial controls, which are incredibly important to protect the money that's been invested in your library, and your personnel policies, which are incredibly important because your staff are the most important asset the library has. So making sure there's a full complement of personnel policies is important. Many of those personnel policies have intersection with law, including equal employment opportunity, recruitment and hiring, access to personnel records. These all have rights associated with them for people that are coming to work at your library. So I would say that if you haven't been involved with of policymaking or you find yourself on the library's policy committee, ask for a report of this checklist. Mid-Hudson can provide one to you, which you can cross-reference with what you have in hand at your library, and then see what's not checked off. And we can help you prioritize those of where are the areas of highest liability if you don't have policies in place, to help you prioritize which policies need to get made to protect the library and help things go smoothly at your library. On the internal side and the board category, the conflict of interest item, that is now legally required. So annually, you must be signing a disclosure form that discloses any financial intersections you have with library business. So if that's not something that's happened at your library or your policy is obviously dated pre-2011, there's a good chance you're not in compliance with the law when it comes to conflict of interest. The public expression item under meeting procedures, if you might recall from Trustee Essentials, the public's allowed to come into your meeting and observe the board do the business of the library. They don't have the right to speak unless the board grants that. And we've recommended here, and I'm reinforcing this, that you should have procedures related to the public speaking at your meetings to make sure things don't get out of hand. Now, on the administrative side, I'd say many of these things are good ideas, but some also intersect with law, like public access to records, or FOIL, which stands for the Freedom of Information Law, which all public libraries fall under. So if you're a municipal public library, a school district public library, or a special district public library, you're required to follow the Freedom of Information Law, which means you have to have a public access records officer. You have to have a list of which records you retain and are requestable through FOIL. And that goes into that one at the bottom there, records retention, which is also overseen not by law, but by regulation through the New York State Archives, which tells you which records you must retain and have available upon request to the public. And this is something that sometimes we don't know about until we get a FOIL request and we're like, huh, we were supposed to be keeping that, huh? So good, again, good thing to know ahead of time and have all set up in your organization. The financial controls all line up with best practices from the Office of the State Comptroller, and there's really excellent documentation from the Office of the State Comptroller on these items through what's called the Local Government Management Guides, which you can Google, OSC Local Government Management Guides. They have internal financial control, a documentation that's written in language for you and me. It's really accessible and very, very helpful. So again, if you're on the library's policy committee, but more importantly, the library's finance committee, those would be good documentations to get your hands on and be familiar with, so you understand the implications of these policies if you're reviewing them or maybe establishing them for the very first time. So all of these policies are talked about more fully on our website, which you see quoted on the screen there at midhudson.org. There's a whole section for library trustees in the topics area of our website, which includes a clearinghouse of sample policies. So if you find that you don't have one or you want to measure your current policy against how other libraries do things, you've got a pretty hefty collection of other libraries' policies to compare to, which I think is something that a lot of people find valuable. If you talk to other people on your board, I bet they've probably made use of that collection, and we do try to build it on an ongoing basis as things change and get updated. So right now I've got on my list, Casey, I don't know about yours, but to look up the equity, diversity, and inclusion statements people are now hunting for. We've got a growing list of sustainability policies that people are looking for. And last night we just saw that there was a new law passed in New York State under the labor law area related to requiring public organizations to have a pandemic response plan, which is great since we're in a pandemic right now. It'll be great for the next pandemic too, but that will be added to this list in the next go around. So Casey, before we jump into our mini case studies, I wanted to see if there's any more questions on the board.
We do have a couple of questions. So we had somebody ask, regarding privacy, does the Patriot Act require that librarians reveal a patron's borrowing record?
So the Patriot Act, the USA Patriot Act, was a law that was passed right after 9/11, the terrorist attacks on America. And what it did was create a new rule that actually made it much easier for the federal government to access library patron records, which was very controversial. It meant that not only could they come in and get access to those easier because they could go to what was called a secret court, a FISA court, and get a court order requiring the library to reveal information, which that in and of itself was a little strange, but not unheard of. But what it did do is muzzle librarians. So you were not allowed to tell anyone that you received this court order to reveal information. So your library director wouldn't be able to tell you, the board of the library, that this had come in. They could only talk to legal counsel. So it was very controversial. It has been loosened a little bit with the USA Patriot Act, which came out, they edited it, I think within the past 2 to 3 years. So it loosened it a little bit, but still allows for what's really a secret court, not a public court, a secret court to issue subpoenas for library patron records.
Okay. How do you filter out books or other publications that might be seen as incendiary?
Hmm. Well, I think the issue is who's defining what's incendiary, right? So there is definitely selection training that your library staff goes through if they went to library school or they've learned from other people in their organization of how to make selections for the library collection. They're looking at vetted sources. They're looking at community needs. What does the community need, whether it be what the library's community's high school curriculum is calling for, or maybe a community read or something like that. Certainly I think personal politics sometimes influences what people are picking for the library's collection, whether a library director or a selector on the staff may infuse some of their own thinking into how the collection is developed. Whether or not something is incendiary is a subjective issue. For the most part, there's definitely some books that clearly have been proven to be wildly, globally accepted as incendiary. But those are the types of things that if they were to appear on the shelf, you don't want any one person deciding to pull it back off the shelf. You want to have a policy in place that allows for a process to consider the item, to have an open discussion about the item, to research reviews and reactions and a wider scale to that particular item before making a decision of whether or not it is going to come off the shelf at your local library. That ultimate decision lies with the board of trustees, not one member of the board or one member of the community.
Okay. What are your thoughts on libraries offering controversial programming such as drag queen story time?
I'll say again that controversial is subjective. So in one community, it might be seen as controversial. Another community, it will not be seen as controversial. We had that happen in Columbia County just last year. The Hudson Library, that was just City of Hudson, has been doing drag queen story times for probably 2 years now. Not really controversial at all. But a more rural library in the same county did a drag queen story time, and it really was controversial. People from all over the state were writing in to complain about this library's drag queen story time. So part of there should be a programming policy for sure at your
Mm,
library, but it's really about knowing your community's needs. Why are you doing that policy? If you're serving a community that is diverse, that has a lot of people of different backgrounds that see themselves represented in that program, it might be very appropriate for your community. If you don't have that type of community or you don't see that need, what need is the program speaking to? I think there are not so subjective decisions on that respect. So I think we can't classify, certain programs as controversial or not, because it really does depend on the context in which the program is offered. So some programs I think have very clear answers of what would be considered controversial, and others we have to think about them in context of who we serve and what we're trying to accomplish with that program.
okay. Um, how do you deal with a board member who refuses to sign the ethics statement?
I would say that in your library bylaws, it should be a requirement of being a trustee that they sign that statement, right along with, if you miss 3 meetings, you're out. If you violate the ethics standard statement, you're out. And so if they won't sign it to begin with, that is a good sign they're not a good fit for the library board. So I would say that it's not a knee-jerk decision. We certainly want to hear why that trustee doesn't want to sign it and consider their point of view. But overall, they'd have to have a pretty compelling reason, because the stuff in that ethics statement is not controversial.
Okay. With policy review, how far back does one need to go date-wise in listing when policy was put into place and reviewed? All dates should be listed if available. If not available, then what?
So I learned something interesting about 5 years ago, and please remember I've been working at the system for over 20 years. I just learned this 5 years ago, that you actually have to save all previous iterations of a policy if you are a public library. So a municipal public library, school district public library, special district public library, you have to archive the old versions of your policies. So I would recommend from this point forward, you're always listing that review date and you're saving the previous iteration in an archived file. And I think you can definitely claim, well, I didn't know that until I came to this workshop with Casey and Rebecca on September 17th, 2020. Move forward in good faith and do it the right way from here on out.
Okay. Um, is there a list of specific materials, weeded materials available? I'm going to ask the asker of that question to maybe clarify a little bit more in the question box. Are you looking to find out which materials were weeded from the collection? If so, there might be a report that you can run in the ILS and Sierra to find that information. But if there was other weeded out materials, or if you wanted a list of books that have been challenged for censorship in the past, that's something that ALA does try to track. Okay. So we have one more question. Can you provide some guidance for conflicts among board members in priorities of values which can affect budgeting? How to address differences in views about collection development via the MHLS versus the local library?
So a big component of policy making is tying back to your plan of service, which is a whole different workshop. But you should have a plan. Maybe it's called a strategic plan or a long range plan that's based on community input and is shaping the library of the next 3 to 5 years that you're helping to create while on the board. The input that you've gotten from the community should be helping to see where the areas of emphasis need to be. So at the top level, your policies should be speaking to that long range plan. The areas of the collection that are getting developed, that's the why behind the what. That's why you're developing a collection perhaps in the way that you are. The selection issue of what gets put into the collection, again, this is why there's a whole field called library science that many of you have directors that have gone through a master's level program to learn how to do this in a balanced way, in a way that both respects points of view, but also community needs. And we also can't assume we understand community needs without a thorough study. So again, we want to move away from one or two people's opinion and elevate it to a professional level of the selection criteria that's being used to build your collection. There's literally hundreds of books written on this topic in our profession. So I'm not sure it's something I can answer in a 30-second quip during our workshop this morning. But I would say that if you find that there's clashes on the board a lot, that you have significant philosophical differences on the board, it might be time for a board retreat that's facilitated by a professional that helps the board come to a common vision for what kind of library you're trying to create, that respects multiple points of view, but doesn't allow loggerheads over differing points of view to get in the way of governing the library, which is truly the library board's job. So if you find there's unpalatable language in a policy, it gets debated out, we come to consensus, we move on. We're not making selection decisions in board meetings. So if you find that you're getting kind of micro level conversations that are impeding board business, the first question is that even a topic that's appropriate for the board? Is that to be taken off into a committee or actually as a staff issue that needs to be flagged? So I think with your director's help, you should be able to mediate some of that stuff, but certainly acknowledge that sometimes it's too big of an issue to overcome and that we might need to, again, have a board retreat or professional development opportunity that helps bring people to a more civil place to get the work done of governing the library.
Okay, and so I have a follow-up. Thank you, Darlene, for clarifying. So you can get a list using the Sierra ILS, the interlibrary loan software that we use to manage the collections at our libraries. So you can get a list of materials that have been weeded from the collection. but items that have been weeded, they have a certain status of discarded, and so that is kept for a little while, and then we actually clear those out to make room in the database for new records. So periodically, I think quarterly or annually, we clear out records that have been discarded. So for a little while, you can see which items have been weeded, and after a while, you won't be able to see them anymore. They'll just kind of be gone.
I would also add to that, you can certainly get a list, but it doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you why it was taken out, because you might see a title that you're like, oh my God, that's such an important book. Why on earth would it get out? Maybe it was because it was torn up and a dog chewed on it. So you can't necessarily tell that. They're not going to annotate every book that was weeded. It would take too much time. So I would say you need to keep that in mind as you look at a list of books that's been weeded.
Definitely.
All right, we ready to put our attendees' knowledge to the test?
Yeah, I think we are. I think they're ready.
All right, we have 3 scenarios for you. I think we'll get through at least 2 of them today before we wrap up. We want to respect your time and end on time today. So let's see how we do. What we're going to do is show you a little case study, very, very tiny. Casey's going to read it out to you. You're going to see some choices of how the board president or the board should respond. And we'd like you to put your answer in the chat box, A, B, C, or D.
Okay, so in our first scenario, the board president receives an email from a patron demanding that the Harry Potter series be removed from the library's collection due to their belief that the series promotes witchcraft and sorcery. So please review the options at the bottom and tell us, what should the board president's first step be? So I'm seeing some things roll in here. It looks like D is pulling into the lead. A lot of folks think that D is the best option, to refer them to the library's policy on collection development and ask them to fill out the library's request for reconsideration form.
Ding, 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 ding. That's right.
All
Your
right.
library should have a request for reconsideration form. There's actually a standard form nationally that you can use or adopt, or you could build your own. But I'll tell you what we found over the course of at least my 2 decades of dealing with this kind of stuff is that 90% of the time when a patron challenges a book, they've never read it themselves. So one of the things we want to do is slow down the complainant. We want them to write out why they don't like it, indicate if they've read it or not, and really think through that request for reconsideration for presentation to the director. If they don't like the director's finding, then your policy should have it then brought to the board for consideration. These are extremely rare. You might go through your whole tenure on the library board and never be confronted with this issue, but if you were, it's something you want to handle diplomatically and transparently, so it doesn't blow up into a big PR problem.
Okay.
Oops, oh, I'm sorry, Casey, I skipped your slide there.
Okay. In the second scenario, the director approaches a patron who is not wearing a mask in the library and asks them to don a mask and points to a copy of the library's board-approved policy, which requires a mask to be worn at all times while in the library facility. The patron refuses and storms out of the library. The patron contacts the board to complain that their constitutional rights are being trampled by the director's insistence that they wear a mask while in the library. So please, in the chat or question box, indicate which answer you believe to be the correct course of action for the board president's first step. All right, looking pretty good here. We have a D with an exclamation point, actually, and we have a number of Ds coming in the question box.
So right again, we didn't want to tax you too hard this morning, but this is obviously a really hot topic right now in libraries due to COVID. And this goes back to that issue of the library being a limited public forum. We've got the intersection of both the executive order in New York State requiring people to wear a mask in public when they can't social distance, combined with the library's right to set the code of behavior and require rules for patron behavior in that space. So again, reasonable accommodations come into play here too. Just because someone either can't or doesn't want to wear a mask doesn't mean they don't have a right to access library services. It just will be done in a reasonably accommodated way that protects the majority of the people in that space from catching COVID at this time. Nice job.
Okay, and our final scenario for all the marbles, the board receives a written complaint from a parent of a 13-year-old that the library staff refused to answer their inquiry as to what library materials their teenager had checked out on the teenager's own card. The staff refused. The patron then complained to the director, who also refused to reveal what the teenager had checked out. So please, in the question box, indicate what should the board's response be? Some people are quick on the draw with the D option.
All D, all day. So yeah, a written response from the board president, because this is the one that intersects with law. And I'm really impressed that you got this one right, actually, because what most people don't realize is that the state law is not age specific on protecting patron privacy. So if a resident of any age has a library card, their patron record is protected under New York state law. So again, it's not, about negotiating with the parent. It's not about what actually the kid took out. It's about protecting that patron's right in the eyes of New York state law. And upholding that is tough in some cases. When we do customer service training for frontline staff, they think this one is ridiculous. It's like a no-brainer, because usually it's a different situation. Usually it's like a 7-year-old who lost a library book under their bed, and the parent's just trying to figure out what they're looking for, which of course you want to help that parent out in that situation. But you'd actually have to hand the printout to the child, and the child would have to give it to the parent. But it's, again, a tough one sometimes. You can see how this is hard. One of the worst stories we have related to this is actually before I ever became part of the library profession, I used to work at a domestic violence, a shelter for victims of domestic violence. And we had a woman who was there because their library called to let them know their book on how to get a divorce was available, and left it on the at the time, the answering machine, and the husband heard the message and went after the wife because of it, and resulted in her fleeing the home because of violence. So these little things we might not think about. If you're standing in line at the library to check out a book and staff are just making conversation, oh, I love this one, or I read this one too, or oh, my child also has autism. We have to understand the sensitive nature of some things that people are accessing at our libraries, and help them feel confident that their privacy is being respected. So again, I think that most of our library staff, they mean very well. They're just trying to do their jobs. But this is something we do need heightened awareness of. So really nice job, everyone. And maybe we gave away the farm there by having D as the answer on all of them. But just to wrap things up here today, when you're evaluating your policies, which I think is going to become a more frequent activity boards need to do in light of the new minimum standards, there's some tips here from the handbook for library trustees of New York State. Again, making sure you're compliant with all laws and regulations, which speaks to the need to not only be paying attention to what's going on, which your director should be doing. Mid-Hudson helps with this a lot, but you also may need legal counsel on some things, particularly your personnel policies. Making sure your policies line up with your mission and goals and plans that are community-based. Making sure you're consistent with that Library Bill of Rights and the Freedom to Read statement, which we put in your packet this morning. Make sure they're thorough, clearly written, easy to understand, so anyone walking through the door would be able to relate to what that policy is. And again, going back to that idea of the social responsibility and public good, that we're doing this in the best interest of the community at large, not slanting things one way or the other to help out one group in the community. And again, taking the staff into consideration, because they are the ones on the front line enforcing policies, particularly those that face the public, that they're easily enforceable. They're not asked to jump through too many hoops to get things done or fill out too much paperwork to do stuff. We want them focused on the positive stuff of helping to educate our community. And of course, at the end of the day, and you've heard me say this several times this morning, that you're designing these policies to maximize library services and access for the greatest number of users in the community. Those are I think the best part of the past few years is watching boards and directors evolve policies from the 1970s and 80s, so they actually reflect a commitment to access for people rather than commitment to the rules of the library that make things easier for library staff. And that can be a tough corner to turn sometimes in some libraries. But I think everyone's starting to go in the right direction on that from what we can see where we sit here at Mid-Hudson. So we've got the 2-minute warning here, but if there's other questions, we're happy to consider them. Casey, anything unanswered in the box at this point?
We have a couple of thank yous and no questions right now.
All right, cool. So just to let you know, we're going to send you the slides from today. And again, that'll have that link for how you get the free print copy of the handbook if you're interested in that. Right here, you've got my contact information and Casey's contact information. Part of the service that we provide to your library is to be technical advisors to your board. And this is an area that obviously has a lot of technical assistance that could come into play. So if you want to learn how other libraries have handled things, if you're looking for a sample policy in an area, you want to talk through an issue that maybe you're having on the board or with your director, we are here to help with those types of things at no charge to your library at the point of service. So again, feel free to contact us. It's our job to help you and we're happy to do it. And we'd just like to say thank you for coming today and giving your time and energy to your local public library. We very much appreciate what you're doing and we thank you and we're here to help you.